Welcome to Season 2 of the Erotic Realm podcast. I'm Em, a sexologist, erotic psychology researcher, and nerd obsessed with psychosexuality. I'm also a 24/7 kinkster. You can find everything I'm doing at psychologyofdesire.com. And now for today's episode. The following conversation explores submission, not as weakness, but as a conscious expression of curiosity, intelligence, and depth. In this conversation, I'm joined by Calliope, a CEO, writer, and self-described submissive, to explore what happens when a life built on competence, leadership, and responsibility meets the desire to surrender. We talk about discovering kink later in life, the psychological pull of submission for people who are constantly in control, and the role curiosity plays in opening erotic doors. We also speak openly about grief after the loss of her partner, and how writing, community, and staying connected to desire can help keep life expansive, even during profound loss. This is a conversation about control and surrender, grief and renewal, and the kind of erotic curiosity that seeks depth rather than spectacle. Enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Erotic Realm. Today I'm delighted to be exploring the erotic realm of Calliope. Is that correct? Calliope?
Calliope.
Calliope. I knew I'd get it wrong. Welcome, Calliope.
Thank you.
So before we step into kink or psychology, I'd love to start with you as a person. What does your day-to-day life look like right now, and how are you spending your time when exploring eroticism isn't front and center?
I run my own company, and so, when I'm not being kinky, I am on Zoom calls most of the day, most days. And I'm managing my employees and, drumming up more business for my company. And so I would say a large percentage of my time, of my sort of non-kinky time, gets eaten up with work. And then I'm also a big traveler. So when I do have free time, I love to spend it traveling. So I recently spent 3 weeks in the UK with my family and some friends over there, and that was really rejuvenating. And so I always look for opportunities to travel when I can.
Amazing. So when you do speak about your eroticism, how do you currently identify in terms of your sexuality and your kink identity?
I would say in terms of my sexuality, I would say I'm a straight, woman. And uh, I also identify as a submissive. I came to the kink world quite late, I would say. It'd be interesting to know on average when people kind of find kink in their lives. But for me, it came at age 38. I'm now 43. So I've only been in the kink lifestyle about 5 years. And so I do identify as a submissive. If the nature of my submissiveness changes slightly depending on my partner and the kind of specific dynamic between us. But if I was forced to pick a sort of subcategory of submission, I would probably say a service submissive is the one that tends to sort of resonate with me the most. But again, because I'm quite new to the world of kink, I am still learning, what turns me on and what I enjoy. And that exploration has been fun.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you found the kink world when you were 38. What happened at that time? Why did you discover it then, and how?
So I would say I've always had, maybe not always, but for a long time, I would say I've had sort of submissive tendencies and perhaps always been interested in a sort of I didn't have any of the language. I didn't really know what this meant. but I've always had a sort of curiosity about DS. And looking back, I can't really remember all the specifics. And my relationships up until I was 38 were very vanilla. And by vanilla, I don't mean boring. And I think it was Ancilla who wrote a great piece the other day about the use of the word vanilla. Um, so by vanilla, I don't mean boring or unsatisfying. I just mean not BDSM. Um, and so I had vanilla relationships up till 38, and then I was on Tinder. Um, and there was a guy who had something about being a daddy dom in his profile. And I remember that being really enticing and sort of like really excited about that. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. And so he and I ended up matching on Tinder. We spoke because of the pandemic. We spoke for about 3 months,
Mm.
uh, just by FaceTime and texting before we met in person, because it was really the height of the lockdown in 2020. And then we ended up meeting, and that was my first sort of DS relationship. Um, so I would say I sort of maybe always had an inclination in this direction, had never really explored it, had never really had partners who had wanted to explore it. I had never asked. And then it was this relationship when I was 38 that was my first sort of overtly kind of DS relationship.
Okay. And when you met him, did you know that you were going to be exploring kinky relationships only from then on? Did you say goodbye to the vanilla world, or are you still open to that?
I would say I'm still open to that. I mean, I would say my entire identity is not, and my entire sexual identity is not wrapped up in kink.
Mm-hmm.
I have had, you know, a handful of very fulfilling vanilla relationships with people whom I loved dearly and who loved me dearly. And I could see that being part of my future moving forward. So it's DS isn't having DS be part of my relationship is not a deal breaker for me. However, I have learned that I really enjoy it. And it doesn't have to be for me a sort of 24/7 full on experience. Neither of, or I would say sort of two out of, I've been in three kind of DS-ish relationships. And only one of those I would say was a sort of pretty intense DS relationship from the sort of psychological standpoint. The other two are what I would call, and I'm sure some of your listeners will object to me using this term, but kind of like DS light. Um, and there were fulfilling things about all of those relationships. And so I'm sort of open to it looking a variety of ways moving forward. But I have learned that having at least some element of DS is satisfying to me.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what you enjoy in terms of kinks. What would you say are your top 3 kinks? And if I asked you and said you could only explore 3 kinks forever, what would they be and why?
Mm. Again, I would say because I would still consider myself quite new to this world, I really do feel like I'm still learning what I like and don't like. I would say in my sort of non-sexual life, I'm pretty headstrong and confident. Again, I run my own company. Um, when you and I were doing the pre-interview chat, I was saying, I give presentations all the time to large groups of people. And so I'm no shrinking violet. And of course, I think it's a misconception that subs are shrinking violets.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something about having someone who's, to be honest, like a little bit willing to put me in my place, like who's
Mm.
a little bit willing to kind of stand up to me and sort of not take my bullshit. I really respect that in people. Now, they have to be able to do it in a like caring, playful way,
Mm.
but I think I can like kind of run people over if they let me.
Right.
And so I appreciate someone who kind of like stands up to me in that way. So I would
Mm.
say that, and of course, that doesn't have to be in a DS context. My vanilla relationships, those men were able to do that with me as well. But there's that kind of like that thing where they can just, your dom can give you a look and sort of
Mhm.
put me in my place. There's like that element, right? And now sometimes that also has a corporal punishment, sort of domestic discipline element. So that might be on my list of three things that I would keep, kinks keep that I would keep moving forward. Um, and then the service element, which is surprising to me, and I would say has become an increasingly big part of my submissive identity, is the service piece. And I wrote a piece on FET a while back about why I made my partner's bed, or why I made him a sandwich, which is something I sort of swore I'd never do, right? Like that meme or whatever it is about making me a sandwich. I was like, screw that. I'm never doing that. And here I am making my partner a sandwich and then kneeling on the floor and Nadu as he eats it. I mean, it's just so, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, would I do that? That concept would have been so foreign to me.
Mm.
Um, but there's something about that that I find very fulfilling. Um, I'm not going to be a trad wife. I'm not going to stay at home and make sourdough bread. But I have found that the service element is a surprisingly fulfilling way for me to sort of uh, indicate my love and devotion to my partner.
Mm. So what changed over those 5 years? Was it feminist ideas around feminism and that women shouldn't submit to men? Is that what you're getting at there?
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. And I know this is something that you've discussed with many of your previous guests.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's something interesting to me about sort of, in a way, feminism subverts the sort of stereotypical or expected roles of men and women in a heterosexual relationship. Um, and I think there's something kind of interesting. So I grew up with sort of from more of a kind of feminist standpoint, right? I was always encouraged to pursue my career and achieve at high levels in my career, achieve at high levels as an athlete, achieve it at high levels as a student. I'm not saying I always did achieve at high levels, but I was sort of always encouraged to prioritize that.
Mhm.
And this idea that I could be whatever I wanted to be, and I have good judgment, and I could earn my own money, and I don't need to be dependent on anyone, was
Mm.
certainly more of the ethos that I grew up in. Not just from my parents, although I would include my parents in that. And there's something kind of interesting to me about subverting that, and it's like weirdly to kind of return to traditional values in some ways.
Mhm.
But again, like, I am not the sub for someone who wants a 24/7 sort of trad wife dynamic. I am
Right.
not that woman.
Mhm.
But there are elements of that that I find sort of refreshing, and I kind of like
Mm.
to sort of playfully, yeah, sort of subvert that sort of dynamic that is actually the more expected dynamic for me, right? The more expected dynamic for me is to be in control. And there's
Right.
something about playfully kind of toying with that I like.
Mhm. There's definitely a lot of erotic energy in it. So you've actually written about how people are often surprised that you're Ivy League educated, run your own company, and are kinky, well, submissive. What's some of the feedback you've received about this, and what assumptions do you think people hold about power, intelligence, and sexuality that make that combination seem contradictory?
I mean, I certainly think, again, the fact that I run my own company and am submissive, I think is surprising to some people.
Mm.
In fact, I don't think it actually is that surprising, but I think the image that people have in their mind of a submissive and the impression that I give people, who know me in real life, those two things don't seem to fit well together. Um, and so I think that creates some cognitive dissonance in people's minds. And then I don't know how, so that part is easier for me to explain, right? Like it's weird that she's a CEO and she's submissive. I kind of understand why that is confusing to people, even though I don't actually think it's that confusing.
Mm.
I don't know, the fact that I'm sort of well educated and um, kind of come across as put together in my real life, and then have this sort of like slutty, erotic side of me. I don't know how surprising that is to people. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people who went to Ivy League schools who are kinky.
Mhm.
Uh, and, but I think there's like, it's just some, again, cognitive dissonance that's created there because I have this rather sort of polished, maybe slightly, sort of stick out my ass, and not in the fun way exterior. And then people are like, oh, but she puts naked pictures of herself on the internet, right? I
Mm.
just think people think that's odd.
Mhm. Do you think that they would assume that you would be dominant in the bedroom, if anything, based on how you are in everyday life?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think, yes, again, because I'm not a shrinking wallflower. So I think people would assume that I am as dominant in my sexual life as I am in my professional life.
Mhm.
But it's funny. I asked my ex-boyfriend, with whom I had a decades-long vanilla relationship, and he and I are now very close friends. And I admitted to him not all that long ago that I had started, exploring kink relationships and specifically DS. And he didn't really say much. He just sort of paused and kind of nodded and smiled, like, it wasn't, he didn't have some huge reaction to that. And I sort of felt a compulsion to explain, like, oh, with me on the S side of the slash, as submissive. And he just looks at me and he goes, well, yeah, of course. And I
Mm.
was really surprised. So maybe I think it's surprising that I'm a submissive, but maybe in fact, people who know me really well wouldn't be the least bit surprised by that.
Mhm.
He certainly was not.
Fascinating. So would you say that you experience submission more as an escape from control that you have in everyday life, or is it another intentional expression of who you already are?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. This whole thing about women who are, dominant in their careers, sort of wanting to give up the reins and give up control in their sexual lives, I know is a sort of common trope. I don't know the extent to which that's true for me. I think part of it is true. Um, but I think for me, my submission is actually more a reflection of, it's a sort of a different manifestation of my overachiever kind of wanting to please elements of my personality.
Mm.
So I was a teacher's pet. I was a straight A student. I was a student athlete, right? Like I just am sort of always striving to achieve. And I think being a submissive, kind of is the adult way to be the same person I was as a, 15-year-old, right? It's a way to kind of, the teacher's pet aspect, right? Like the being like the kind of good girl part of that, I think is very real for me. The receiving praise from my dom for doing something well, and fulfilling his expectations. I think it's all sort of again a very different and very adult manifestation of personality traits that have been true for me my entire life.
Mhm. Yeah, you're very clear that your submission comes from confidence, curiosity, and devotion, not trauma or self-negation. How do you personally distinguish empowered submission from submission that would feel misaligned or diminishing?
So I certainly cannot speak to others' experiences. I know very few submissives, so I have been fortunate to forge some strong relationships with folks via FET with some other women and specifically some other submissive women via FET, but I don't pretend to know their whole lives and, all like every element of their backstory. And so I can't speak to what it looks like to come to submission from a different angle than I have. But I have heard anecdotally, which again may be another stereotype, that some people, not just women, kind of find kink as a way to process or deal with or cope with trauma,
Mm,
and sort of darkness. And I don't know if that's true, but that all I can say is that has not been my experience. So I came to kink quite late in life, and I did it because I was just sort of feeling more comfortable in my sexuality and more willing to uh, ask partners to try things, willing to see, or I probably didn't even have the guts to do that, to be honest, but at least more willing to sort of seek out partners who were likely to lead me there.
hmm
Um, and so it really did come out of a place of kind of confidence in my sexuality, curiosity about my sexuality, feeling less shame about exploring certain elements of my sexuality and some interests and fantasies that I had. But I led until I experienced my last two breakups have been eh, horribly traumatic. But until 2023, I had experienced very little trauma in my life. I had sort of a white picket fence upbringing, and have been just like very privileged to experience very few kind of speed bumps in my life. And so that wasn't the angle to which I came from kink.
mm, hmm So I want to get into that a little bit deeper and bring in a piece of psychological research here from social psychologist Baumeister. And he published a paper called Masochism as Escape from the Self. And his core idea wasn't that submission comes from damage or pathology, like you're speaking about. Instead, he suggested that for people who live with constant responsibility, decision making, and self monitoring, that erotic surrender can offer temporary relief from the pressure of always being on. So, when you hear that idea that surrender can be a relief from the constant self monitoring, does this resonate with your own experience as a CEO? Does it bring relief from the constant self monitoring that you may experience in that job?
A little bit, although I would say I self-monitor as a submissive as well. So I don't know that it
Mm,
provides much of an escape from that, to be honest, which again, I think is I should probably be in therapy for that. But I your question and that piece of research did make me think about um, the ways in which submission encourages me to be more vulnerable.
mm,
I would not describe myself as a particularly vulnerable person.
right.
Um, and there's something about submission that I think kind of forces me to let my guard down more.
Mm,
Um, and I don't know, I have a really hard time explaining that. Um, so it's not as much for me a kind of like release from making decisions or a release from control. There are certainly elements of that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist for me at all, but there is something about kind of putting my trust in someone else and um and yeah, just sort of letting someone see that side of me
mm,
that I do find both very sort of stretches my limits, but also very good for me.
hmm
Like I think that is actually healthy for me to do that. Um, and I think being a submissive pulls that out of me more than other elements of my previous sex life have.
Mm. You mentioned that you self-monitor as a sub. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Do you feel like your mind stays on even when you're being submissive?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally like a not good at turning my brain off kind
Mm-hmm.
of person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't know that my brain is ever really off. I mean, I'm not someone who is plagued, well, until my recent trauma. I'm not someone who's typically plagued by my thoughts, but I would not describe myself as someone whose brain is very quiet.
Mm.
And so yeah, I'm always sort of thinking about, like, even when I'm submitting, I'm thinking about, am I pleasing him? Am I doing this the right way?
Mm.
Not in a sort of self-flagellation kind of way, right? Like, not in a punishing way, but just in a, like, striving to do the best that I can.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's probably always on. I'm always sort of monitoring, like, am I doing this the right way? Could I be doing more? Should I say this differently? That kind of thing.
Mm. So when you're in a submissive dynamic, do you feel the desire to experience that shift build in you over time, or is it always there? For example, I've spoken to CEOs that when they've been in the CEO role for quite a long time, they feel that need to experience the other side of the slash, so to speak, build, and it gets to a point where they just have to have that submissive experience. Is that something that you also notice?
So are you asking whether, having been on the S side of the slash for, some period of time, 5 years, whether I feel an inclination to explore the D side, or are you asking whether the kind of nature of my S side has morphed over that 5 years?
I'm also asking, so when I've worked with CEOs who are quite often in a dominating role, but they're actually submissive in the bedroom, I've had the feedback quite a lot that some of them find that the more often they need to be in the CEO role, for example, if they've really had to be leading a group for quite some time, they feel that need to experience the submissive part of themselves grow over time, and the desire kind of increases in some of them.
Mm,
I'm wondering if you have that experience as well, considering you run your own company.
interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And I I don't know, I suppose, is the short answer to your question.
Hmm.
It is possible that happens. Um, uh, yeah, it's interesting. So in my first kink relationship, which, as I mentioned, started in 2020 during the pandemic and ended in the fall of 2023, that relationship started with more DS elements, which sort of faded over time. And I do think that I ended up missing those components, and sort of craving those components more.
Mm.
Um, but I that could have just been related to the fact that they had become less frequent over time, and
Hmm.
less to do with the fact that, I'm relatively dominant in my kind of everyday career life. Um, I will say that the place that I sometimes get the weird itch, um, is with spanking. So I would not describe myself as a masochist. I have learned, especially through one of my relationships, that I don't particularly enjoy pain for pain's sake.
Hmm.
Um, and so maintenance spankings and things like that, it turns out, are not really my cup of tea. There is an element of pain, that I enjoy as service. So, one of my exes, one of the three people with whom I've been in a kind of DS relationship, um, he had a bit of a sadist streak in him, and so there was an element of experiencing pain as service to him.
Mm.
That was fine. I didn't enjoy it as much as domestic discipline. So pain in response to something I had done incorrectly. I found more enjoyment from that.
Mm-hmm.
But all that to say, if I go, I would say about 3 months without being spanked, I sort of crave that.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know whether that's connected to my job and my sort of non-sexual life,
Mm.
or if it's just a weird thing about me. But I get this sort of weird itch to be spanked, even if I haven't done something wrong, right? Even outside of a domestic discipline kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
I will just be like, I just want to get spanked. I think in the same way someone might say, I just like need to get fucked.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I just need to get spanked. But that's quite rare for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing. You've also said the form your submission takes shifts slightly depending on the partner. What would you say changes and what remains consistent in those dynamics? What feels essential to your submission regardless of who you're with?
So I think a bunch of the components that I mentioned earlier. So I would say I'm an achiever, and I sort of want to um, kind of do right. I would also say I'm relatively competitive. I tend not to be hugely competitive with other people, but I'm a former athlete, and so there is a sort of competitive piece to me. Oftentimes that's competing with myself again to kind of do my best, but I think those are pretty inherent character traits for me, and those probably undergird my submission, not regardless of whom I'm with, but sort of to some extent irrespective of who I'm with. But then there are other pieces that sort of get dialed up and get dialed down, depending on my partner. So the partner I mentioned a moment ago, um, he had again a bit of a sort of sadistic. I would not call him a sadist, but he had slightly more of that element. Right, he just liked to spank me.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an element of me taking that and enduring that pain as service to him. And so I like sort of ended up being more of a masochist in that role than I was with my other partner, who had a really, I mean, impact. He was raised here in the South and of the South US. And this idea that you hit women was pretty abhorrent to him. And so it was very difficult to get him to spank me.
Mm.
Um, and so there was very little masochistic elements in my relationship with him. And there was much more of like a kind of service element to my relationship with him. Like he's the one I made a sandwich for, despite
Mm.
saying I would never make sandwiches for someone. So again, those elements kind of dial up and dial down, but I would say they're built on a foundation of the character traits that I mentioned a moment ago.
Mm-hmm. And you've also shared that your brain needs as much stimulation as your body. What does psychological or intellectual engagement look like for you inside a DS dynamic? How does someone evoke submission in your mind as well as your body?
Oh, I don't know. I'm really bad at. I wish I was better at articulating this, because I think it would help my partners if I could do a better job of this. And I do think there are plenty of people, including some of the people whom you've interviewed previously, who do a really beautiful job of describing this. Um, so I'll just say one other thing before I attempt to answer your question, which
Mm-hmm.
is I will say this is like one of the most frustrating things for me
Okay.
about some of the quote unquote DOMs on FetLife, who and again, this is like a million people have said this before me, but who just think that BDSM is wielding a flogger or putting someone, spanking someone over your knee, or just all the sort of physical manifestations of BDSM, the things you can videotape, the things you can take pictures of, etc. And sure, those activities for me personally can be fun, but I really don't get anything out of them in the absence of a DS relationship that includes those psychological components.
Mhm.
So I don't want to be spanked by some random dude. And for me, that is not about safety. I mean, I understand that there is a safety concern there as well, but for me, because so much of my submission is about service and is about achieving and is about pleasing, I need to respect and trust and love the person that I'm with.
Mm.
And I need to feel that he loves and respects and trusts me. And so even though I do take on the submissive role in my uh my romantic relationships, I can only do that when I feel like I'm peers with my partner.
Mm.
Um and so and me feeling like a peer with my partner means that um again, he can like stand up to me in a way that is like playful and respectful, but he can stand up to me. Um, Oftentimes, the men I'm attracted to have a like very sarcastic sense of humor. They are uh, really intelligent, right? Like I want someone who puts me over his knee, but also has an intellectual discussion with me about an article in the New York Times,
Mhm.
or one of Ancilla's pieces on FET, right? Like one of my partners and I used to send her pieces back and forth to each other all the time and like have intellectual discussions about kink and relationships and BDSM and what it meant and the kind of layers of that. And I just don't think that you're like, domly doms on FET are interested in that kind of engagement, but that's what it takes to make me interested. And that's what it takes to make me want to get over your knee.
Mm. Mhm. Very well articulated. Thank you. I really appreciated that. And yeah, you spoke to it beautifully. Mhm. So, another tradition that we have on the podcast is exploring a quote with you. And today's quote comes from Anai Nin, who was a diarist and writer whose work explored female desire, psychological depth, and erotic truth at a time when women's inner lives, especially their sexual ones, were rarely taken seriously. So, she once said, "I must be a mermaid. I have no fear of depths and a great fear of shallow living." So, when you hear this quote, does it resonate with how kink allows you to explore depth rather than surface level experience? And do you think your curiosity about BDSM is less about intensity and more about meaning?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Um, Again, I would say I came to kink and specifically DS from a place of wanting to explore greater depths of my sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at, at the time, and perhaps many would argue still at this day, I don't know exactly what that means. Um, but it it just allowed me to sort of play different roles and try out different activities and just sort of play with the nature of my relationship in a way that I do think added depth. Um, so I would say yes to the mermaid quote.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of depth versus intensity, I think that was your second question.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, I would say that's true. I mean, um, I wouldn't describe any of the three sort of kinky relationships that I've had as super intense, right?
Mm-hmm.
None of them have been a 24/7, you know, relationship with, well, these were 24/7 relationships, but they weren't 24/7 DS relationships, with, heavy impact play and, none of them have, none of them perhaps look intense in that way from the outside. But I do think that they've added both depth and a level of intensity to my sex life and the way that I envision myself.
Mm.
And I would just say, like, a lot, and again, I don't know how much of this just comes with age, right? Again, I'm 43. And so I just feel less apologetic and more comfortable and confident about who I am, and particularly who I am as a sexual being, that I think I just like I couldn't have felt when I was certainly 23 or 33. And so, how much of that is, it's sort of like the chicken and egg question.
Hmm.
So how much of my entry into kink came from increased confidence and desire to explore and have my sexual relationships be more intense and more deep, and then how much of it was like actually kink accelerated that or facilitated that, or increased depth and increased intensity and increased confidence. And I don't know, it's probably a combination of both.
Hmm. So you've also shared that you're navigating profound grief after the loss of your partner, and I'm so sorry for your loss. Grief and kink and desire is rarely spoken about. Has staying connected to your desire or your sexuality through such things as writing, the kinky community, played any role in your healing?
Yeah, for sure. I think I took a break from vet for a month or two when things were particularly horrendous.
Mm.
Um, and I've been surprised by how terrible the grief has been. Um, and although I know I can't rush things, and I'm not sort of looking for a shortcut out of grief. I think it is what it is, and I just have to sort of go through it as it comes. But I am trying to do things that used to bring me joy, right? So, um, being a sexual being and writing on FET and posting on FET, for example, as one manifestation of my sexuality, at one point, brought me joy. And at a time when I'm feeling very little joy in my life, um, I sort of think there's an element for me personally, and I want to be super careful here, that if I've learned nothing else in the past few months, it is that everybody's experience of grief and path to healing is really different. And
Mm.
so I want to be super clear. I am like, what I'm about to say is by no means doling out advice to anyone. I have been very humbled by this experience, and any advice that I might have given to someone who was in a similar situation 6 months ago, I've now learned, like, I should just keep my mouth shut. Like,
Mm.
people just don't understand what grief is like. But for me personally, I have found that there is an element of faking it till you make it. And so I don't feel sexual right now. I mean, I would say I feel, since this happened in early October, I feel largely asexual. It has, sort of understandably killed my sex drive. And I can kind of wallow in that, and that would be fine, right? There's no judgment on that. I can do that. I can just sort of go with that feeling. Or I can try and do things to kind of get my groove back. And for me, I've chosen to do the second. And I'm not saying that again, that's right for anyone else, but for me, I'm like, okay, well, let me give this a go.
Hmm.
So that includes, continuing to do some photo shoots. Like I did a photo shoot with Walnut. I've done a photo shoot with Dark Images, who's a dear friend of mine. Since this all went down, I've not played at all with anybody, because again, I have no desire. But yes, I think there is an element of faking it till you make it. So that's part of why I've continued to be engaged on FET. I think the second thing is there have been a handful of people in particular who have who some of whom I've met in person and some of whom I've not, like Mummy Candy, for example, that has been, really helpful in my healing. And so there have been a few people who I've found through FET who have been able to provide some comfort to me, and help me in that way. So that's the second reason I've stayed engaged. And the third reason I've stayed engaged is because I do enjoy writing, and I would be writing even if I weren't writing on FED. I mean, I have kept a diary since I was in seventh grade, so since
Wow.
I was 13 years old. I think I'm now up to diary number 30 or something like that. And so writing is a very helpful way for me to process emotions. That has always been true for me, and that continues to be true in this particularly terrible time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I do find writing cathartic. That is much less about other people reading it. So for me, it's less about the engagement with others. It's just helpful for me to get my ideas down on paper. And if other people read it and enjoy it and find it helpful, that's lovely. And I'm very pleased about that. But for me, it's just sort of cathartic and helps me feel more in control of my emotions at a time when I have felt extremely out of control, which is a very difficult space for me to live in.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing a bit about that process and what you're going through. Like I said, it's just really not spoken about enough. And I'm sure even though you're not offering advice, just sharing that part of yourself will be helpful for other people that are going through or have gone through a similar thing. So I really thank you for that. If I can, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your diaries. So you mentioned that you've been writing and keeping diaries since grade 7, so over 30 years now, or it must be
Yeah,
getting
about 30
closer.
years. Mhm.
Yeah. Do you ever go back and read, what you were writing when you were in grade 7, grade 8? Do you, read it and compare to the person that you are now? Do you get some perspective on your growth in that way?
Oh gosh, I mean, it is so cringeworthy
Is
to
it?
go back. Yes. Oh gosh, it's terrible. So, I almost never go back and read them. In fact, most of them I've never read before.
Mm,
I I was curious at some point, and did go back and like read the ones, maybe the first one, right? Which was like age 13.
mhm.
And it was so cringeworthy that I I could not bring myself to read the rest of them. So no, I do not go back and read them. Um, and that has at least some to do with the purpose that they serve for me.
Mm,
So, um, I do not use my diaries to document my life. I
mhm,
do not write every day. I do not say, today I had 5 Zoom calls, one of which was being interviewed for this kinky podcast.
mhm.
Like, I don't document my life in that way. In fact, I will go, in some cases, months without writing in them. So they are not a good reflection of my life. You could not make a documentary, not that anyone would want to, based on the information that's in my diaries, because it would look like Swiss cheese. Um, I use it, as I said a moment ago, to really process feelings.
Mm,
And so if I've had a fight with a partner, and actually, I mean, I would say 90% of the things I write about are relationship issues.
right.
Um, so when my relationship is going well, I tend not to write in them. But when I'm
Mm,
struggling in my relationships, usually romantic relationships, but they could be friend relationships or family relationships, I will use it as a way to sort of process whatever feelings I'm having and like kind of organize those often in advance of then like having a conversation with that person about it. Um, So it's sort of twofold. It's like it helps me gain control over my emotions because I don't do well when I'm feeling out of control of that. And then, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's the only purpose that it serves. And then sometimes it serves as almost like a planning, like a plan for a conversation with someone, and
Right.
helps me be more articulate, more organized, and less, kind of emotional in that conversation.
Mm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, yeah, it's just my diaries are crazy.
Yeah.
They also, like, the other problem with my diaries and why they wouldn't be good for a documentary is because I only write in them when I'm struggling.
Mm.
Not only are they, they just sort of not give a complete picture in terms of timeline, right? Chronological, the plot has a lot of holes in it. But someone reading my diaries would think that I am just, going through struggles left and right, because that's the only time I write things in them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's extremely rare that I'm like, this fabulous thing happened to me today. Let me tell you about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it also gives a very skewed perspective of my life in that way. So going back and reading them is also, in addition to being cringeworthy, is a bit depressing.
Oh, it's still an amazing insight into the human experience, though, and just how important relationships are and, the struggle that comes along with them. So I would still find it fascinating, I think.
Yeah, well, I have said, if someone asked me at some point, maybe my previous partner, I think he asked me, if the house were burning down, what would you
Mm.
grab? Right, like one of those kind of getting to know you questions. And I said my diaries,
Ah, okay.
uh, because even though I never go back and read them,
Mm.
they are irreplaceable. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
really, everything else in my life is replaceable, but those are not.
Mm.
So they are the one thing I would grab if my house were burning down.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I wish I'd kept more diaries. Now, as part of our conversation today, I asked you to bring along something to share, such as a quote, book, or a movie that's influenced your eroticism. Can you share with us what you've brought along today and how it shaped your erotic realm?
So the I can share a piece that I wrote on FET about grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I agree that with your earlier point that the intersection of grief and kink and sexuality isn't talked about very much. I mean, hopefully that's because people aren't experiencing, horrendous grief very often. So hopefully it's just sort of few and far between that the opportunity even arises to talk and write about that intersection.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, and also let's just be honest, right? Like, grief is not sexy. I was actually joking with a friend of mine the other day because I uh, sent this brief piece to him, and he sort of skimmed the first couple paragraphs or whatever, and then stopped reading it. And I gave him a hard time. I was like, "What? You're not on FET to read pieces about, depressing pieces about grief." And of course, he's not there for that. He's there to see hot women. And so I am happy to share this piece about grief, and just my experience
Please.
fumbling, honestly trying to navigate it.
Mm-hmm.
Grief is a terrible thing. It's worse than I imagined, more intense and less predictable. Sometimes it strikes with a breath stealing sharpness. Sometimes it hovers quietly as a dull ache. And sometimes it slips away just long enough to disarm me before rushing back uninvited to twist the knife. It has affected me in ways I didn't anticipate. I'm still a functioning human being. I work, I travel, I socialize, but I feel like a hollowed out version of myself that I don't quite recognize. Lately, I'm more introverted. I spend time with family and friends, but I'm quieter and more withdrawn. A friend of mine told me it's as if my light has been dimmed, which felt painfully accurate. My concentration and memory have taken a hit. I remember little from the week preceding and following his death. His funeral is a blur. I assume that's my brain's way of shielding me from the worst of the trauma. Grief has made me cry on planes, and in grocery stores. How embarrassing. At dinner with my family last week, I had to quietly step away from the table after seeing surf and turf on the menu. That was what he ordered at the last meal he, his mother, and I shared the day before he died. Waterproof mascara is now my default. Least surprisingly, grief has largely extinguished my libido. And even on the rare occasions embers of desire glow a bit, I've taken a hiatus from masturbating. For as long as I can remember, I've been someone who, no matter what, or who I was watching or reading or thinking about in the lead up to an orgasm, always thinks about my partner when I come. I just come harder that way. Now, thinking about him, combined with the release of an orgasm, sends me straight into violent sobbing. I started to worry that my brain might link orgasms to out of control crying in a way that would linger. So I'm taking a break until I'm less of a basket case. At this point, I feel largely asexual. I'm grateful that Dark Images and Walnut let me enlist their help with Operation Fake It Till You Make It. Mummy Candy recently said to me, quote, "Grief is the least bloody logical thing ever," end quote, which was clarifying and oh so British. Yes, the circumstances surrounding his death would leave even the most emotionally stalwart to wobble. But I think part of my unraveling comes from the fact that I see myself as rational, logical, and in control. Grief has stripped that away, shaking the core of who I thought I was. I know I won't feel like this forever. I know grief will eventually soften into sadness. And while that sadness will probably take up permanent residence in my brain, it won't sprawl the way it does now. I'm lucky to have friends, family, and a kink friendly therapist helping me through. For now, grief comes and goes on its own terms, indifferent to timing, logic, or my desire to manage it. It's a terrible thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's truly touching, and you write so well. And yeah, I'm just really touched hearing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for allowing me to share it. And it has been helpful, as I sort of mentioned earlier, to connect with others on FET, some of whom have themselves gone through grief, maybe perhaps not exactly for the same reasons I have, and some for the same reasons I have. And I've found it helpful to know that I'm not alone. So in addition to this piece being primarily just cathartic for me to write, um, if it helps someone else who's going through something similar, then that's a great thing as well.
I'm sure that it will. So thank you so much for sharing that part of yourself. Not quite sure what to ask next because it's just so, profound what you're going through. But I guess I'd just like to ask, what's next for you? What's something that you're looking forward to, over the future? What's your plan in terms of kink and eroticism? Are you just taking it day by day at the moment? Do you have something that you're looking forward to experiencing? What's next for you?
I don't have anything. I was about to say in terms of my sexuality, I'm just taking it day by day. Let's be real, and I'm just sort of taking it day by day in life in general right now. And so there's nothing specific on the horizon for me, or that I'm sort of gunning towards in my future, other than just feeling more like myself again. And again, I'm not hopeless. I need no convincing that time will heal and I will feel better tomorrow than I do today. Well, actually, it's surprising how nonlinear grief is. Again, I
Mm.
know that's not a new concept, and many people have written about the nonlinear nature of grief, but it's still surprising when you're actually going through it. So tomorrow might not be better than today. Maybe today is good and tomorrow will be worse. But over time, I am convinced that there will be an increasing number of good days. And I think I will eventually feel like myself again, in general, and specifically, in regards to my sexuality. So eventually I will get out there and date. That relationship, I hope, will have elements of DS.
Mm-hmm.
And I, look forward to the day when I am ready to continue to explore that side of me.
Mm. Mm-hmm. So thinking about where you're at now in your journey and where you've been, if you had to sum up your eroticism in one word right now, what would that word be and why?
Oh God, that's so much pressure. Uh, Exploring,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
and a few words about why. I would say, again, still relatively new to this world, and so I'm uh, still learning things about myself and my own sexuality. I learned different things about myself and my sexuality with different partners that I've had. So with the three kink partners I've had, I've learned different things from all of them. Um, and then I'm also exploring, right now what it means to regain your sexuality after going through trauma. It's not the kind of exploration I had hoped to be doing at this point in my life,
Mm-hmm.
but lo and behold, here we are. And so, yeah, it's like sort of what does that look like to regain my sense of self?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for sharing your erotic realm and for speaking so thoughtfully about intelligence, submission, curiosity, and grief. It's been a pleasure exploring your erotic realm with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again. I'm Em, and this has been the Erotic Realm podcast. Thank you for listening to the Erotic Realm. If this episode stirred something in you, please take a moment to follow the show, leave a rating, or write a review on wherever you're listening. It helps more people find the show and brings visibility to this deeper conversation about eroticism and self-understanding. I'd also like to invite you to dive deeper into the psychology of desire, including my writing, research, and upcoming courses over at psychologyofdesire.com. This is where I release the Psychology of Desire case files, behind-the-scenes thoughts, and intimate reflections every week, plus more. Until next time, stay curious, stay embodied, and keep exploring. Also, as always, stay perverted.